Okay, we're going to do something a little different in this video. We're going to be looking at what's colloquially become known as the Michael Heiser stuff. I was a little late to the party on the Michael Heiser stuff. I didn't really start looking into Michael Heiser's ideas until probably 2 years ago, around in 2023. But before that, I was pretty much very fascinated with the antediluvian period. I was really looking at a lot of different stuff, looking at different cultural material, texts from the Babylonians, the Sumerians, all the stuff that along those lines. And I was actually reading Tim Chaffee's book about the sons of God and the Nephilim. And that's where I learned about Heiser, was in his book. So what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to look specifically at the Nephilim, okay? There's been a long-standing debate as to whether or not the Nephilim are the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men, or whether the Nephilim are separate from the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men in Genesis 6:4. Since the so-called Michael Heiser stuff has come out, there's been a lot of pushback. It's one of the main pushbacks that I've found is that the Nephilim are separate from the Gaborim. They're not the same. Okay, and what I want to do is look specifically at Genesis 6:4, and when I say look specifically at Genesis 6:4, I mean at the syntax and the grammar. Okay, I'm not going to be speculating on who the sons of God are. I'm not going to be speculating on whether they're humans or whether they're divine beings. You're not going to get any of that in this video. I'm not going to be looking at any other literature surrounding this, okay? I'm not going to be looking into Second Temple Judaism literature. I'm not going to be looking into any of that. My specific purpose was to look at the syntax and the grammar and determine what is actually being said if we look at it, critically and with a very close eye. And this is something that I haven't found Michael Heiser having done. This isn't something I've found Tim Chaffee to have done, or a lot of the other guys that kind of promote this material. Now, I'm not saying they haven't done it, but I certainly haven't seen it. I've watched a lot of Michael Heiser stuff. I've listened to a lot of his podcasts. I've read his book, most of his book. I actually have not completed that book. I read about half of it and decided, well, I'm going to look into this myself. I don't need to any more, I don't need to be told what it says. I get the idea. Now let's look into it and look at what I think is really going on in the text. So what I'm going to do is specifically look at the text as syntax and as grammar and determine whether the Nephilim are the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men, or whether they are not the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men. So first I'm going to start by looking at, I'm going to read a quote from the NET Bible Full Notes Edition. In Genesis 6:4, the Nephilim, we get a translator's note right after Nephilim, and it says, the Hebrew word Nephilim is simply transliterated here because the meaning of the term is uncertain. According to the text, the Nephilim became mighty warriors and gained great fame in the antediluvian world. The text may imply they were the offspring of the sexual union between the sons of God and the daughters of humankind, but it stops short of saying this in a direct manner. Okay. Now, I think that is basically a true statement. I agree with that, most of it. The thing I would question is where he says the Nephilim became mighty warriors. That's not technically what the text says, and we're going to look closely at that. The key word there is became, and that's going to become an important topic that we're going to address in this video. But the specific statement that, the text doesn't outright come out and say that the Nephilim are the sons of God is a true statement. That's not what it says. It doesn't say the Nephilim are the product of the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men. But the question is, does the text justify that interpretation? I believe there are strong reasons that point into that direction. If we look at the ESV translation, the ESV reads, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. Okay, this is a typical translation. You'll see this pretty consistently in the NKJV and the ESV, the NIV, the NET, and so on and so forth. They all vary just a little bit, but particularly the ESV and the NKJV are very close. Now, based on that translation alone, I think it is quite probable that the Nephilim are separate from the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men. I say probable because based on that translation, all the text really says is that the Nephilim were in the land in those days and afterwards when the unions took place. I mean, that's not unreasonable at all. And that's what a lot of people argue when they make a presentation against the so-called Michael Heiser view or Tim Chaffee's view or any of the other guys that teach this kind of stuff. And it's a perfectly reasonable argument, and it's perfectly valid, in my opinion, if that is the translation you use. But there are other possibilities within the Greek syntax that, quite frankly, changed the meaning of the text. Now, one of my main problems with the typical translation that you see and the typical interpretation, which is the interpretation that those who oppose Heiser and Chaffee and these guys, that typical interpretation is that the Nephilim are just there, okay? They're literally no more than scenery. They're there, just like the rocks, the trees, the sky, and the clouds. They serve no literary purpose, and they serve no narrative role or function. In other words, they don't really belong there. I mean, they don't really have any purpose whatsoever. So we're kind of left wondering, why even mention the Nephilim at all? Why? Some have attempted to answer that question by saying, well, they're there as a time marker. But that doesn't make a lot of sense because we have time markers that function as time markers that we compare the Nephilim as a time marker to. In other words, we have the genealogy of Noah. We have the birth of his sons. We have the declaration of 120 years leading up to the flood. We have the flood itself. I mean, these are time markers are already established. So the Nephilim being in the land doesn't really seem reasonable as a time marker. So the question becomes, what is the author's intent? What is the literary purpose of the Nephilim in this text? There really is none. If you look at it strictly as the Nephilim were there when the unions took place. So what I'm going to be doing in this video is looking at an alternative translation that changes the outcome of how we understand this passage. Let's go ahead and get into that now. Now, the first thing I'm going to be showing is basically it's just an AI breakdown of the structure of the Hebrew grammar of Genesis 6:4. Okay, it's really not that complicated, and I'm not going to get into every detail right here unless it's necessary. The structural breakdown of Genesis 6:4 is basically broken down into 4 parts, okay? Beginning with the Nephilim were in the land in those days. Now, this is the main clause, and it is described as an independent verbal clause. Now, keep in mind, this is an AI breakdown of the typical grammatical approach to Genesis 6:4. There are different ways to break down Genesis 6:4. However, it's pretty much standard that the main clause is that the Nephilim were in the land in those days. Now, the second section of the structure of Genesis 6:4 is and also after that. Okay, this is a coordinated temporal phrase. It basically extends the temporal frame of the main clause. It's not a clause on its own because it lacks a subject and a verb. It functions as a temporal adverbial modifier parallel to in those days. Now, the third section of the structure of Genesis 6:4 is the subordinate clause. When the sons of God came into the daughters of men and they bore children to them. It's also called an Asher clause beginning with when the sons of God came into the daughters of men and they bore to them. The final clause is typically styled a resultative or identificational clause. They were the mighty ones of old, men of the name, or men of renown, depending on how you translate this. It's just a nominal clause. That's just basically how grammarians typically break down Genesis 6:4. So what I'm going to do is break down Genesis 6:4 into 4 sections with some minor slight changes. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and make my presentation. And when I'm done with my presentation, I will go back and explain the changes that I have made in terms of translation and interpretation, and also go into detail as to why I've made those changes, and we'll look specifically at the pushback to those changes. Now, the main clause, the noun phrase ha-Nephilim. The Nephilim functions as the grammatical subject of the main clause. It precedes the verb hayu. The Nephilim came to be or emerged, which is a qual-perfect verb in the third person plural. While hayu is often translated statively as were, it can semantically carry the nuance of existential emergence or coming into being, particularly in the land in this case. This is especially true in narrative contexts such as the chapters preceding and including Genesis 6. If hayu is therefore translated came to be, then the verse takes on an entirely different meaning. The main clause is then describing the emergence of the Nephilim in the land, and not their mere static existence. The coordinated temporal phrase, the temporal phrase, and also after that, introduces a temporal adverbial clause via the conjunction and, signaling a subsequent emergence in the land. This emergence in the land is contrasted against the temporal prepositional phrase in those days. Therefore, the text is indicating a dual emergence of the Nephilim in the land in two time periods, in those days and after that, not static existence of the Nephilim in the land throughout the two time periods that the author is distinguishing between. Now, the fourth section, the subordinate clause. The temporal clause is followed by the subordinate clause. When the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore to them those. Now, this clause contains two qual-perfect verbs. They came into, euphemistic for sexual union, and they bore, indicating childbirth. The subordinate clause therefore functions as a temporal clause modifier of the main clause, explaining etiologically when and how the Nephilim came to be in the land. The subordinate clause therefore describes the mechanism by which the Nephilim emerged or came to be in the land, the union of the sons of God and daughters of men. The pronoun him, or those, is typically separated from the subordinate clause and treated as the beginning of the result clause. However, when him is included in the subordinate clause, him is the direct object or result of the unions. Where we may have expected the syntax structure, they bore to them children, instead, we read, they bore to them those. Those is not a self-referent. The pronoun those doesn't refer to itself. Rather, it refers to the antecedent noun found in the main clause, the main subject of the clause, the Nephilim. In other words, they, daughters of men, bore to them, sons of God, those, the Nephilim. Those being both the direct object of the result of the unions, while also referring back to the antecedent Nephilim. As a result, including those in the subordinate clause, what follows then becomes a relative clause modifying hema, or those, as opposed to the traditional resultative or identificational sense of the last section of the verse. Now onto the final section, the relative clause. In this reading, the final segment, the mighty ones of the age, men of the name, functions as a relative clause modifying hema, or those, not as a separate identificational statement. The relative clause immediately follows him, beginning with ha-Giborim, the mighty ones, which is an adjective, gibor, functioning as a noun, substantively, because of its masculine plural suffix, giborim. Ha-Giborim is describing those, the antecedent, which in turn grammatically refers to the antecedent, the Nephilim, the mighty ones of the age, men of the name. The phrase men of the name, Hashem, with the definite article points to a specific name, not merely to the general idea of being well known or famous. Rather, the name with the definitive article most likely refers to the name provided in the main clause, Ha-Nephilim. In fact, many translators capitalize Nephilim as they recognize the Nephilim as a proper name. Thus, the syntactical construction suggests that the Nephilim are not merely pre-existent beings, innately static through the two time frames, those days and after that, but are the product of the unions described in verse 2, and in the subordinate clause of verse 4, emerging in the land, both in those days and after that. This reading describes a dual emergence of the Nephilim in the land. The phrase in those days and moreover after that frames a single mechanism, the unions, as described in the subordinate clause, as the cause of Nephilim emergence across two temporal phases. The line of demarcation between these two phases is a material change in the Nephilim state of existence in the land. By material change in state of existence, I mean discontinuity, as such is implied by a second emergence in the land, which contextually can only refer to the flood in my mind. Although the flood is introduced later in the narrative, its presence retroactively provides the line of demarcation of before and after in Genesis 6:4. The narrative is written from the perspective of a much later time period, and to an audience of that same time period, and having knowledge of what had already transpired historically. Thus, the Nephilim came to be in the land through the same single mechanism, the unions between the sons of God and the daughters of men, both before and after the flood. Okay, so what follows is an excerpt from a conversation that I actually had recently with a gentleman on Biblical Hermeneutic Stack Exchange. Now, he approached the text from the traditional translation of Hayu as were. Okay, this was kind of his baseline approach to the text. And he came from the position of refuting Heiser and Tim Chaffee and all these other guys by saying, hey, all the text says that the Nephilim were there in the land when these unions between the sons of God and the daughters of men took place. So, based on that perspective, I can completely understand the rationale for these questions. Now, this was his question. What is the grammatical basis for rendering Hayu as came to be rather than were? From what I've seen, many skilled translators across different backgrounds seem to favor were as the more natural reading in this context in noteworthy scholarly consensus. While a certain translation may be possible grammatically, does possibility alone establish probability if in the absence of contextual support? Now, this question is multifaceted. I mean, there's basically three questions in this one question, and I'm going to deal with them one at a time. Now, the first question, what is the grammatical basis for rendering Hayu as came to be rather than were? Well, this could easily be reversed. Okay, what is the grammatical basis for rendering Hayu as were rather than came to be? So when we look at Bible Hub's interlinear, we see the Nephilim were. Okay, the word is Hayu. Now when we click on that and we look closely, it says to be, become, come to pass, exist, or happen. Okay, to exist, to become, to come into being, to happen, occur, always emphatic and not a mere copulate or auxiliary. In other words, it's not just a syntactical link, okay? To come into being is a reasonable semantic choice when it comes to translating Hayu or Haya in the text, okay? This is perfectly reasonable. It's perfectly within its semantic range. So when we return to the question, what is the grammatical basis for rendering Hayu as came to be rather than were? Well, how about the entire context of Genesis up until this point, including Genesis 6 itself? Now, I asked AI to make a probability assessment of how many times Haya could potentially or reasonably be translated as came to be, or in the sense of emerging, between Genesis 1 and Genesis 6. And the probability rate was upwards of 65%. In fact, I think this is a classic example of not being able to see the forest for the trees. Okay? The entire text of Genesis, from Genesis 1 to Genesis 6, including Genesis 6, is etiological. It's dealing with origins and the specific cause of those origins. Now, the question goes on to point out that many skilled translators across different backgrounds seem to favor were as the more natural reading in this context, meaning Genesis 6:4, in noteworthy scholarly consensus. Now, in my opinion, the individual who is posing this question is actually understating his case. There is a much stronger case to be made here than what he is allowing. Now, the reason I say there's a much stronger case to be made here is that the translations that you'll find on Bible Hub, Bible Gateway, Biblia.com, any of the online translations, they are all unanimously rendering Hayu as were, not as came to be. In other words, there is not a single popular Bible app that renders Hayu in an emergent sense rather than a static sense. So there is a much stronger case to be made here, and that case is based on translator authority. Now, as usual, there are exceptions, and one of the exceptions is the Scripture for All translation of Genesis 6:4. It reads, "The ones distinguished, or the Nephilim, they became." So Scripture for All is essentially the lone translation on the internet that renders Hayu as became, or in the sense of came to be, as opposed to were, which is the sense of static existence. Now, interestingly, when I first discovered this Scripture for All translation and read that the Nephilim, they became in the earth, I was in the midst of a discussion with a gentleman who had a YouTube channel, and I was discussing this in his comment section, and he had done a 4-part series on why the flood was local rather than global. And in one of those videos, he had argued that the presence of the Nephilim in Numbers 13:33 was an indication that the Nephilim had survived in the land, that the Nephilim had survived the flood, okay? And in his mind, this was evidence that the flood was local rather than global, covering the entire earth. And one of the arguments that he made is that haaretz in Genesis 6:4 should be translated as in the land rather than in the earth. Now, ironically, once I discovered Scripture for All translation and began to look at the semantic range of Hayu and Haya, I argued the point that the text doesn't necessarily say that the Nephilim survived the flood. What the text is saying, if we take Haya as an emergent sense rather than a static sense, what the text is saying is that the Nephilim came to be through the unions of the daughters of the man and the sons of the god. Okay? In other words, everything I've argued in this video. And obviously, he took a strong stance against Haya as an emergent language rather than static language. And he, of course, appealed to the translator authority that we just discussed. He argued that every single translation of Genesis 6:4 renders Hayu in a static sense rather than an emergent sense. Well, ironically, every single translation on Bible Hub, on Biblia.com, on Bible Gateway, etc., they all render haaretz as in the earth rather than in the land. That's correct. Every single one of them. Okay? So really what it comes down to is this individual was willing to argue translator authority when it supported his position, and he was willing to argue against translator authority when it did not support his position. So, it becomes a selective support for translator authority. In light of the fact that translation unanimity does exist, particularly in the case of Genesis 6:4, I propose that we ask the simple question, why does it exist? And also, is translation unanimity evidence of translation authority, if for no other reason other than that translations are unanimous? In other words, is it possible that there are other reasons why translations translate certain terms and phrases in certain places consistently, reasons that don't necessarily support the conclusion that unanimity implies authority? I believe there are. I suggest that both translation bias and translation tradition are both legitimate reasons that we find unanimity in our translations, and neither of these two factors lends any weight to the idea of translator authority. If you have watched any of my previous videos, I have discussed at length that present indicative verbs in the New Testament, particularly when the text addresses resurrection, are unanimously translated in a gnomic sense, rather than in the sense of present ongoing action. There is evidence that there are many instances where modern translations have expanded from the gnomic sense found in the interpretive traditions established by the King James translation, in contexts other than that of resurrection. This is evidence that some translations are breaking away from translation traditions. However, translation bias continues to constrain those modern translations from rendering present indicative verbs that appear in resurrection contexts as ongoing action in the present. I believe we see this same phenomenon going on in Genesis 6:4 as well. although I lean more towards interpretive tradition rather than interpretive bias, although bias cannot be entirely ruled out. Let us take, for example, Genesis 2:7. And formed Yahweh Elohim the man from the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. This is one instance where Hayah is unanimously translated as become, having an emergent sense rather than a static sense, was. If we were to read a translation that rendered Hayah as was rather than became, it would sound out of place and wrong due to translator tradition. Another example is Genesis 1:2. In the beginning, Elohim created the heavens and the earth was without form and void. Although there are a few translations that render the verb hayah in the phrase as become without form and void, the overwhelming majority of translations have was. The same translation tradition applies here. It seems out of place to have become where we are used to reading was. However, the contextual and grammatical conditions that exist in both verses are identical. In both verses, we have God action followed by the emerging result, yet translators treat them differently. One is treated as static existence, while the other is treated as emergent existence. This inconsistency suggests that translator unanimity may reflect tradition or bias, not necessarily linguistic authority. In other words, the decision to render the verb haya with a static English verb rather than an emergent English verb is not based on grammatical or contextual differences, as there are none, but rather tradition or bias. We see the same contextual conditions in verse 1 and 3. The Elohim said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God action followed by the emergent result. Yet translators opt for a static sense of the verb haya rather than an emergent sense, and there became light, notwithstanding the emergent conditions. This principle is also true with the recurring phrase, and Elohim said, and it was so. The same contextual conditions exist. God action followed by emergent result. Therefore, the phrase could just as authoritatively be rendered, and it became so. So we've addressed the question, what is the grammatical basis for rendering hayu as came to be rather than were? We've also addressed the issue of scholarly consensus. Now let's look at the last part of this question. While a certain translation may be possible grammatically, does possibility alone establish probability, if in the absence of clear contextual support? Now, it may be true that the last part of this question does not necessarily assert that there is no contextual support for rendering hayu as came to be. It does imply that there is an absence of clear contextual support for that conclusion. And let me just reiterate, I believe this is just a clear example of not being able to see the forest for the trees. Now, if we look at Genesis 6 and what immediately precedes Genesis 6, we have Genesis chapter 5. Now, Genesis chapter 5 is basically kind of like a time warp through so-and-so begat so-and-so, and so-and-so begat so-and-so, and so on and so forth. So what's happening here is clearly etiological. This is emergent existence through an accelerated timeline in the narrative frame. Now, when we drop out of time warp, we're presented with the same thing. So-and-so begat so-and-so. In other words, the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore to them those. Okay, he hasn't shifted focus at all. But what he has focused on ubiquitously throughout the narrative is etiological context. We have an emergent context. And when we drop out of this fast-forward time work, where does he land? He immediately uses haya in an emergent sense. And it came to pass. Okay, this is the same word, 1961, in the imperfect third-person masculine singular verb form. Okay, same word, 1961, haya. And it came to pass, which can authoritatively be rendered, and it came to be. Now, this is again emergent language in the context of Genesis 6:1. And it came to be that when began men to multiply on the face of the earth, that daughters were born to them. Now this sets the condition. All that has preceded in chapter 5, including Genesis chapter 6, verse 1, is emergent language. Okay, this is all emergent language embedded in the context. Now, one thing that I did find interesting is that when you look at popular translations, you will find that the NIV, the NLT, the ESV, and the BSB all omit the phrase, and it came to pass, or it came to be. In other words, they all selectively omit the phrase, and it came to be. Now, I'm not going to speculate as to what the reason for this is. Initially, I thought that perhaps this is due to manuscript variants. Maybe this is a textual variant. But in fact, it is not. It is not a textual variant. This is a clear example of translation bias being imposed on the text. They omit ha-ya and its interpretation in an emergent sense, and the entire phrase, it came to be. Now, before I continue any further, I want to revisit my initial presentation in this video. I presented this text in the four-section structure that grammarians have typically identified in this verse, and that is a main clause, a temporal clause, a subordinate clause, and a result or identification clause. However, in my presentation, I modified the traditional approach to the transition from the third to the fourth and final section by including those, or hema, in the subordinate clause, rather than having those, hema, begin the final clause. Now, this results in the final clause functioning as a relative clause, modifying those, or hema. After careful consideration, I am now further modifying my view of the grammatical structure of the verse. Rather than redoing the whole video, I'm going to present and explain my modification here. This is my revised breakdown of the verse grammatically. The main clause, the Nephilim came to be in the land in those days. The second section, the temporal phrase, and also after that. The Hebrew wa introduces and signals the transition to the temporal phrase. Now what follows is the subordinate clause, or the Asher clause. Asher, or when, signals the transition to the next clause, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man. Now what I am proposing is that, and they bore to them those, is a result clause that is signaled by the conjunctive wa, and, just as the conjunctive wa signals the transition from the main clause to the temporal phrase, and also after that, I'm suggesting that the conjunctive wa, and they bore to them those, signals the transition from the subordinate clause to a result clause. Now, I am still including those, or him, in the same clause. However, I'm styling this as a result clause, and what follows is a relative clause. The mighty ones of the age, men of the name. Now, another area of the text of Genesis 6:4 that I'm just fundamentally diverging from the traditional translation and interpretation is my proposition that those refers to the Nephilim. Okay? In the phrase, they bore to them those is referring to the Nephilim. So what I'm presenting here is an excerpt from the same conversation that I had on Biblical Hermeneutic Stack Exchange. So this comes from the same individual. He writes, it would also seem an unnatural reading for the grammar to suddenly shift the referent of these back to Nephilim, immediately after describing a new group, the implied offspring, in the immediately preceding clause, the subordinate clause. In Hebrew, referents usually follow narrative sequence and proximity. So what this gentleman is arguing is that those begins the final clause and refers back to the offspring or the children mentioned in the subordinate clause. And he is interpreting the children or the implied offspring as a new group that are distinct from the Nephilim, okay? And that's what I'm going to address here. So what we're going to look at now is the New King James Version translation of this passage. And the reason I chose the New King James Version is because it italicizes the words that are added, supposedly for clarity. These are the words that straighten out the text so that we can understand it. Now, obviously, we can see that children is italicized as well as were the mighty men who were of old. Now, I'm not overly concerned with the addition of were in this text, at least at this point. What I am concerned about is the insertion of children, okay? The insertion of children into the text. And the second thing that I'm most concerned about is the insertion of punctuation and capitalization. Punctuation, capitalization, breaking of a sentence, and adding the word children. In my opinion, all this does is obscure the text. What we're seeing here is not translation, folks. This is interpretive bias being imposed on the text. Now, there's really no other way to say this. Now, we could say, well, their intentions for doing this were to help straighten out the text and help it make sense so that we can understand it in its proper way. But technically, this is an interpretation. Now, all translation involves interpretation, but not to this extent. Now, what all these translations have done, and I'm referring to the NKJV, the NASB, the NIV, the ESV, the NET, all the translations that insert a period between them and those and insert the noun children, is solidify and standardize the separation of him or those from the previous clause, thus obscuring key details that exist in the Hebrew syntax and grammar, thereby normalizing and memorializing their interpretive bias upon the translation itself. So what we need to do in this case is we need to deconstruct the imposed translation that has been placed upon the text. So when we look at this portion of the text and what I'm styling as a result clause in the Hebrew, we see that it begins with a conjunction and a verb. Okay, the conjunction is and. This is the conjunctive wa, and this verb is third person common plural. Okay, common plural is where we derive they. Okay, we have the conjunction and the verb, but this is in the third person common plural verb form, and that's where translators derive they, and they bore. Now, and they bore has a direct antecedent referent, and that direct antecedent referent is the daughters of men. Now, the next word in this sequence is lahem, which is a preposition, simply to. And they bore two, or they bore four. There's other possibilities here, but this preposition is in the third person masculine plural. Them is derived from the third person masculine plural preposition verb structure of lahem. Okay, now lahem also has its antecedent referent, the sons of God. Now the next word is hema, which is the third person masculine plural form of the pronoun those. It's either those or they. Okay, this is somewhat subjective, but many translations have those or they. Okay, now those is derived from the third person masculine plural pronoun. Now this also has an antecedent, okay? But in this particular case, those serves a dual function. Now first, as I said in my presentation, where we might have expected the phrase, and they bore to them children, instead we find the phrase, and they bore to them those. Those are the direct object or result of the unions between the sons of God and the daughters of men in this particular passage. Those does not begin a new sentence. Now even the interlinear can't help but insert children, were, and capitalize those. But there is no punctuation here, folks. Punctuation does not exist here. And the addition of implied children does not exist in the construction of the verb itself. The conjunctive and the third person common plural verb only supports they. It does not support children. Were does not exist in the pronoun, and those is not capitalized beginning a new sentence. This is all editorial interpretation imposed on the text. Okay, we're not looking at that. We're removing that from the text. Once we eliminate children as a direct referent of those, a word not present in the Hebrew, and reject the notion of an implied new offspring group, we are left with an unresolved grammatical and structural tension. The word those functions as the direct object, the result of the unions described in the subordinate clause, yet it also requires an antecedent referent. Now, crucially, it cannot refer back to the antecedent children, not only because no such noun exists in the text, but also because those are the offspring, and therefore cannot refer to themselves. Those is not self-referential. It must point to something previously introduced. If it cannot refer to the inserted children, nor implied offspring, since those are the offspring, and it cannot point forward to the subsequent Hageborim, the mighty ones, then its only viable antecedent is the Nephilim mentioned at the beginning of the verse. This identification completes a subject-level chiasm, which is a literary structure common in Hebrew narrative, where mirrored elements frame a central action. The symmetry structure is deliberate, and the referent is not ambiguous when the text is allowed to speak without editorial interference. Now, once we eliminate the editorial insertion of interpretive bias that's been placed upon the text, we see open up to us a chiasm. The three main subjects of this verse are introduced sequentially. The Nephilim came to be on the earth when the sons of God came into the daughters of men. Now we find the same sequence in the result clause, however, in reverse order. They bore, referring to the antecedent daughters of men, to them, referring to the antecedent sons of God, those, referring to the antecedent Nephilim, thus completing the chiastic structure. Now here is an AI diagram of the same chiastic structure. AI messed up the last part a little bit. They overlapped the words, but you get the general point. We have A, the Nephilim came to be in the land, when B, the sons of God, C, came into the daughters of men. In the result clause, C, they bore, referring to the antecedent daughters of men, B, to them, referring to the antecedent sons of God, A, those, referring to the antecedent Nephilim. Now, in addition to the subject chiasm or the thematic chiasm, there is a second chiastic structure in this verse, and that is a syntactic or clause chiasm. Now, both chiasms have at their cohesive center the unions of the sons of God and the daughters of men. Okay? Now, the clause chiasm is number 1, the main clause, 2, the conjunctive clause, 3, the subordinate clause, which forms the cohesive center of the chiasm, followed by the conjunctive clause or the result clause, and then finally the relative clause, completing the chiasm. And here's another AI-generated diagram. The Nephilim, the sons of God, the daughters of men. The daughters of men, the sons of God, the Nephilim. Now in the clause chiasm, again we have the subordinate clause forming the cohesive center of the chiasm. Now the structure begins with the Nephilim, who are the subject of the main clause. The clause chiasm ends with mighty ones of old, men of the name. Now AI included those in the relative clause rather than the conjunctive clause, but I think you understand at this point that those belongs in the previous clause. Now in the symmetry, we have the men of the name juxtaposed to the Nephilim, which is a proper name. Therefore, I believe that the author intends for the reader to understand that the men of the name is juxtaposed in the chiasm and therefore refers back to the proper name, the Nephilim. To conclude this video, what I am proposing is that the Hebrew hem, or those, does not begin the final clause, but rather ends the preceding clause, forming the final aspect of the chiastic structure. They, the daughters of men, being the antecedent referent, bore to them, the sons of God, being the antecedent referent, those, the Nephilim, being the antecedent referent. Hem does not point backwards to a non-existent hypothetical noun, children, as a new group, as it is assumed by translator syntactical additions and supplied punctuation. Nor does hem point forward to a proposed or assumed new group that is distinct from the Nephilim in the main clause. Rather, it points back to the initial noun of the main clause, the Nephilim. In fact, the typical translation with translator additions, including punctuation and syntactical additions, obscures the text by assuming that the offspring of the unions is a new group, creating a dichotomy that I do not believe exists in the text. I'm simply consistently recognizing the already existent groups in the narrative and grammatical sequence. They, daughters of men, bore to them, sons of God, those, the Nephilim, each referring to antecedents already established in the verse. Now this approach streamlines the narrative, puts the Nephilim in the center of the narrative, having a literary purpose and narrative role and function, is consistent with the grammar, and is consistent with the etiological context of the book of Genesis up to this point, including the opening verses in chapter 6. Now, to my knowledge, there isn't anything in the grammar that prevents what I have proposed. Every discussion that I've had with Hebrew grammarians and every AI language model that I've consulted on the matter has affirmed that there is no rule that exists in Hebrew grammar that definitively forbids the Nephilim from being the referent of those, and also that emerge or come to be is semantically viable if supported by the context, which I believe it clearly is, and I hope to have demonstrated that it is supported by the context, at least to some extent, in this video. Now, thanks for watching this video, and I do hope that you enjoyed it.